I have told this story exactly once before today, and the man I told it to was my horse, Decker, on the ride home from the county clerk's office in November of 1887. Decker is long gone now, and so is most of my pride about how long it took me to say the thing I should have said when I was 27 years old and still had hair worth combing. What remains is Vera, and the valley and the understanding, come to me late and at considerable cost. That silence is not the same thing as dignity, and a man who lets a good woman leave twice because he cannot get the words out of his chest is not a stoic. He is a fool. My name is Cale Rourke. I run cattle on the eastern bench of Dray Valley, a stretch of high plateau range in the hill country west of the Tillman River. The Rourke spread sits on 460 acres of bunchgrass and rimrock, more rock than grass in the dry years, more grass than a man deserves in the wet ones. My father built the original house from pine logs hauled out of the canyon before I was born. I added the second room in 1882, the year my father died, thinking I would need the space. I did not need the space. I did not need much of anything, or so I told myself for 15 years. The Lund homestead sat 2 miles east of mine, where the valley road curved around a basalt outcropping and dropped down toward the creek bottom. Arvid Lund had built it in the same decade as my father, and the two old men had shared a fence line and a mutual stubbornness for 30 years, without exchanging more than 100 words. Their children had been friendlier. Vera Lund and I had grown up on opposite sides of that fence line, which in Dray Valley means you know a person the way you know the shape of the hills, so well you stop seeing it, until the day it changes. We were not sweethearts in the way the valley women would later describe it, which is to say, we were not mooning at each other across churchyards or passing notes by way of the mail rider. What we were was simpler and harder to name. Two young people who understood each other without trying, who could sit on the top rail of a fence for an hour without speaking and not find it uncomfortable, who knew without discussing it that the silence between them was not empty. I was 22 when I first understood that I did not want her to leave Dray Valley. I was 27 when she did. She had gone to teach school in a town 3 days' ride east, a place called Harmon Flat that had more children than teachers and more ambition than sense. She had written to her father, and her father had read the letters aloud at the feed store, and I had stood in the back of that store on 4 separate occasions listening to Arvid Lund read his daughter's words in a voice that cracked on the good parts, and I had not once said to anyone, not to Arvid, not to my own father, not to Vera herself, that I wished she would come back, that I would go and get her if she wanted, that the valley was quieter than I could stand. I told myself it was not my place. I told myself she had chosen. I told myself a dozen things that sounded reasonable in the dark of a cold bunkhouse, and none of them were true, and somewhere underneath the telling I knew it. She was married for 7 years to a man named Gideon Harp, a schoolmaster in Harmon Flat who died of a fever in the winter of 1885. She had no children. She taught school in Harmon Flat for 2 years after that, then moved to a town called Cutter's Mill where the school was larger and the winters, she wrote to her father, were not so mean. She did not write to me. I did not write to her. This was a decision we had arrived at without discussing it, the way we had arrived at most things, by silence and parallel understanding. Arvid Lund died in the late spring of 1887, a Thursday morning, of a heart that had been arguing with him for 2 years and finally won. He was 68 years old, and he died in his own bed with his boots off, which was how he had always said he intended to go. The valley buried him on the Saturday with a preacher borrowed from the next county over, and I stood at the graveside and thought about how a man's whole life narrows down to a rectangle of turned earth and a wooden marker and the people standing around it, and about how Arvid had read his daughter's letters with that cracking voice, and about how Vera was not there because the word had not reached Cutter's Mill in time. She came 3 weeks later. I was mending fence on the south pasture when I heard wheels on the valley road, Not the sound of the mail cart or the supply wagon, which I knew by their rhythm, but something slower, more careful. A hired rig from the Tillman River Stage Depot, it turned out. A single horse pulling a light wagon, a woman sitting straight-backed on the seat, a trunk roped down behind her. I watched from the fence line. She did not look toward the work spread. She was looking at her father's house, which was visible from the road through a gap in the cottonwoods, and something in the way she held her shoulders told me she had been bracing for the sight of it since Tillman River. I went back to mending fence. This was, as I have said, a recurring habit of mine. She was in Dray Valley to settle the estate. Arvid had left the homestead to Vera and a small amount of cash to a cousin in the Eastern Territories, and there were papers to sign, furniture to sort, a lifetime of a stubborn old man's accumulation to decide the fate of. The valley understood this. The valley also understood, in the way that small valleys understand everything that happens within their borders, that Vera Lund was not intending to stay. She had a school in Cutter's Mill, a rented room, a life that had been assembled from the pieces of the one that had broken. She was in Dray Valley for 3 weeks, perhaps 4, and then she would go east, and that would be the end of it. I understood this too. I did nothing about it. The first week she was there, I saw her twice. The first time was at Nolan's Dry Goods, where I had gone for salt and coffee, and found her at the counter buying lamp oil and a bolt of plain muslin. She was wearing a gray dress and a practical hat, and she looked like a woman who had learned not to waste energy on appearances that the wind would undo anyway. Her face was the same face I remembered, with 15 years of living added, not aged in any way I'd call diminishment, just settled, the way good wood settles, into its own grain and weight. She said good morning. I said good morning. I asked if the road from Tillman River had been muddy. She said it had been passable. I picked up my salt and my coffee and I left. The second time that first week was at the gate of the old Lund place, where she was working to free a hinge that had rusted shut over the course of Arvid's last bad winter. I was riding past on the valley road, and I could see the hinge was not going to yield to what she was applying to it, which was a determination that I recognized, and a piece of wire that was not up to the task. I stopped. I had the oil can in my saddlebag that I carried for the windmill joints. I offered it without a great deal of ceremony, and she accepted it the same way. The hinge came free. She thanked me. I said it was no trouble. I rode on. 2 conversations in a week, and I had managed to say nothing in either of them that was the least bit true. The second week was worse, because the second week she needed the well. The Lund place had its own well, dug in Arvid's time, but the casing had cracked at some point in the past winter, and the water it was producing had the look and taste of a thing that had been in conversation with the earth for too long. The nearest good water was the Rurk well, which sat on my side of the shared fence line, which Vera Lund had been crossing without ceremony since she was 9 years old. She crossed it again now, morning and afternoon, with 2 buckets and a yoke, the same arrangement she had used as a girl when the creek ran low. I was aware of this. My cook, a Swede named Bertil who had worked the spread for 11 years, and whose opinions on my personal life were delivered with the subtlety of a dropped anvil, was more than aware of it. "She comes at 7, Bertil said one morning, not looking up from the skillet, and again at 4. "I know when she comes," I said. "You are always somewhere else when she comes." "I've got work." "You had work yesterday when she came, and you rode the long way around the north pasture to avoid the well yard." I did not answer this, because it was true and Bertil knew it was true, and the only thing that would have made it worse was confirming it out loud. She came at 7 the next morning, and I did not ride the long way around. I was at the water trough near the barn when she came through the fence gap, and she stopped for a moment when she saw me there, and then she came on, because Vera Lund had never in her life turned back from a thing because it was uncomfortable. "Morning," I said. "Morning." She set the yoke across her shoulders and lowered the first bucket into the well. "I'm sorry for the imposition. The casing on the home well has gone. I've written to a man in Tillman River about the repair, but he can't come until next week. It's not an imposition. I know you don't mind the well, she said, turning the crank. I meant the she stopped. Never mind. The what? She looked at me then, direct and without ornament, the way she had always looked at things. I meant the general awkwardness of it, my being here at all. You have every right to be here. I know I do, she pulled the first bucket up. That's not what I meant and you know it. I did know it. I stood there with my hand on the water trough, and I knew exactly what she meant, and I had nothing to say to it, and so I said nothing, and she filled her second bucket and fitted the yoke and walked back through the fence gap without looking back. The morning light was on the bunchgrass and the rimrock, and the whole high plateau valley lay bright and indifferent around me, and I watched her go and did not call after her. I was 42 years old, and I was doing it again. Bertil said nothing at breakfast. His silence was louder than the drop Tanville variety. The valley in those 3 weeks had opinions. In a place the size of Dray Valley, which is to say, a place with one dry goods store, one smithy, one church attended by everyone regardless of conviction, and a postmaster who read the postcards before he delivered them. The return of Vera Lund was not a quiet matter. The old women at the church quilting circle had assembled their knowledge within 48 hours of her arrival and had begun distributing it freely. Gruder, whose husband Toll ran the smithy and who knew everything about everyone in the valley from a combination of natural talent and strategic positioning near the front window of the dry goods store, told my neighbor Prentice Holt that it was a crying shame, and Prentice Holt told the man who sold me my winter hay that it was a tragedy of the first order, and the hay man told me directly, in the tone of a man delivering news he expected me to act on. People are saying, the hay man said, loading his wagon, that she's going back to Cutter's Mill at the end of the month. I know that, I said. People are also saying, the hay man said, with the careful emphasis of a man choosing his words, that she's going back alone. I know that too. He looked at me the way a man looks at a wall he has just walked into. You're a difficult fellow, Rourke. This was not the first time I had been told this. In the third week, Gruder stopped being subtle. She came to the Rourke spread on a Tuesday afternoon under the pretext of returning a pie dish that my mother had lent her before my mother died, which was in 1879. Meaning she had held onto that pie dish for 8 years, waiting for the right occasion to use it. She sat at my kitchen table and she put the pie dish down and she said, "Cale Rourke, I have watched you do nothing for 3 weeks and I have run out of patience. It's not your business, me. Everything in this valley is my business, as you well know." She folded her hands. She is leaving on Saturday. The hired rig comes at 8 in the morning and takes her to Tillman River, and from there she gets the stage east. I said nothing. She has not packed her mother's quilt, me said. Vera's mother made that quilt in the first year of the marriage, and Vera has left it folded on the cedar chest in the bedroom, which to my mind means she has not finished deciding. She paused. I could be wrong. You're usually not, I said, and I did not intend it as a compliment or as an encouragement. I'm going to give you some information, me said, and then I am going to take myself home and mind my own business. That'll be a first. She told my daughter that she didn't sleep the first night she was here because she could see the light in your barn from her bedroom window, and she hadn't seen that light in 15 years, and she didn't know what to do with seeing it again. Me stood up. She was a small, square woman with iron-gray hair and the bearing of a person who has never once in her life been uncertain about what needed doing. That's all I'm going to say. She left the pie dish. She went home. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after that, looking at a pie dish I hadn't seen in 8 years, thinking about a woman who had come back to a valley she hadn't seen in 15, and about a light in a barn that neither of us had thought about in any way we'd admit to. and about how the silence between us had lasted so long it had taken on the character of a decision, when what it had really been, all along, was a failure. I did not sleep well that night either. The thing about silence, the particular silence I am describing, the one that had lived between Vera Lund and me for 15 years, is that it does not feel, while you are inside it, like a choice you are making. It feels like the responsible arrangement of things. A woman goes away to teach school and builds a life and marries a man and loses that man and builds another life. A man runs his cattle and repairs his fences and tends his grief and takes no liberties with a woman who has not asked him to. This is not cowardice, the silence tells you. This is respect. This is knowing your place. This is giving her room. The silence does not tell you what she thinks about the light in your barn at night. It does not tell you that room, given in excess and over 15 years, starts to look from the outside like indifference. I knew, sitting at that kitchen table with Bertil's pie dish in front of me, that I had used the language of respect to avoid the risk of saying what I meant. I had called it dignity, and it had been cowardice. Not the dramatic kind, not the cowardice of a man who runs from a fight or abandons someone in danger. The quieter kind, the cowardice of a man who has something to lose and therefore says nothing, and tells himself he is being noble about it, and lets 15 years go by. She was leaving on Saturday. It was Wednesday night. On Thursday I rode out to check the south fence, which did not need checking, and found myself at the top of the bench where the valley lay spread below in the morning light. The work buildings, the valley road, the cottonwoods along the creek, and 2 miles east the Lund house with its weathered roof and its pale curtains in the windows and the smoke of a morning fire coming from the chimney. She was up. She was in her father's kitchen. In 3 days she would close that door, and the valley road would take her east, and I would watch from a fence line, the way I had been watching from fence lines my entire adult life. I sat on Decker and looked at that smoke for a long time. Then I rode back down and found Bertil in the yard, and told him I was going over to the Lund place. Bertil said nothing. He looked at me with the expression of a man who has been waiting 11 years for a piece of news, and has learned not to show excitement for fear of jinxing it. "Don't read anything into it," I said. "I'm going to offer to help with the cedar chest. It's heavy and she'll need help moving it to the wagon on Saturday." "Of course," Bertil said. "That's all it is." "Naturally," said Bertil. I rode east on the valley road. She was in the yard when I came up, sweeping the porch boards with the same worn broom I had seen her mother use 30 years ago. She looked up when she heard Decker's hooves, and she did not look surprised exactly, but something shifted in her face in the moment before she schooled it back to composed, something that I caught and held. The way you catch the light off water from the corner of your eye and know it's there even after you've looked away. "Kale," she said. "Vera," I got down from the saddle. "I came to see if there was anything wanted before Saturday. Heavy lifting, or I know the cedar chest is solid oak. Your father bought it off a freighter in '73. She looked at me for a moment, then she said, "Come in. I'll make coffee." I tied Decker to the post and I went in. The inside of the Lund house was the inside of a life being sorted and closed. Furniture was stacked and labeled. Boxes were tied with twine and marked in Vera's schoolteacher's hand. The bookshelves were half empty. The kitchen had been stripped of the small comforts and reduced to the necessities. On the cedar chest, which sat at the foot of the bed in the main room, a quilt was folded. I recognized it, though I hadn't seen it in 30 years. The pattern of small red diamonds that Mrs. Lund had made the first year of her marriage. It was not packed. Vera poured the coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table, which was the same table I had sat at 100 times as a boy, and for a minute neither of us said anything. The morning light came through the east window and lay across the table between us. "I'm taking most of the books to the school in Tillman River," she said. "They're in better shape than what the school has." Your father would have liked that. He would have argued about it first. A small turn at the corner of her mouth. He thought books should stay where they were put. He thought most things should stay where they were put. Yes, she looked at her coffee. He wasn't always wrong. The silence settled between us, but it was a different kind of silence than the ones we'd been making all week. Not the avoiding kind, not the polite strangers kind. The old kind. The kind that was never empty. Vera, I said. She looked up. I had prepared nothing. I had ridden over to offer to lift a cedar chest, which was the story I had been telling myself since I left the yard. And now I was sitting in her father's kitchen with the morning light between us, and I had exactly nothing prepared. What I had instead was 15 years of accumulated evidence about what happened when I prepared nothing and then said nothing, and that evidence was not favorable. I should have come after you, I said. When you left for Harmon Flat, I should have said what I meant and I didn't, and I've had 15 years to think about why, and I'm not certain I have a reason that would satisfy you or that should satisfy me. I think I told myself it was your choice and I had no business interfering with it. I think the truth was that I was afraid of what you'd say if I asked, and it was easier to let you go and be sad about it than to ask and risk being told no. She was very still. That wasn't respect, I said. I told myself it was, but it wasn't. It was the safer arrangement for me, and I let you carry the cost of it, and I'm sorry for it. The morning light moved, the way it does on the high plateau, with that slow, steady shift that changes everything in the room by degrees without you seeing the moment of change. Outside, Decker shifted his weight and blew. A meadowlark made its remark about the state of things somewhere in the bunchgrass. I didn't know you thought of it that way, Vera said. I know you didn't, that's the problem. I thought she stopped, started again. I thought you were relieved. When I went, I thought I had read it wrong, the whole thing, and that you were content with how things were, and I had made something out of nothing, and it was better for both of us that I went. You hadn't made something out of nothing. No, very quiet, I can see that now. Another silence, the good kind, the kind that is not avoiding anything. I don't know what you want me to say, she said then, and there was nothing plaintive about it. It was a practical question from a practical woman. I have a school. I have a life in Cutter's Mill. I've been building that life for 2 years, and it's not a grand life, but it's mine. I know that. And you're asking me, on a Thursday morning 2 days before I leave, to what? To change it. I'm asking you, I said carefully, to know what I should have told you 15 years ago. That's all I'm asking right now. What you do with it is your business. She looked at me for a long time. Vera Lund had always been a person who looked at things straight, not confrontationally, not with judgment, but with the clear, patient attention of a woman who understood that most things repaid looking at. She was looking at me that way now, and I sat under it the way you sit under weather, knowing you can't do much about it but wait. I need to finish, she said finally. There's still the back room to go through. Arvid kept, you wouldn't believe what Arvid kept. I might, I said. I remember when he kept that broken harrow for 6 years on the grounds that the metal might be useful. He never threw away a piece of metal in his life. Something crossed her face, grief, briefly, and then something warmer behind it. Come help me with the back room. I helped her with the back room. I will not tell you that we resolved anything that Thursday, because we didn't. What we did was go through Arvid Lund's accumulated 40 years of ranching life. The broken equipment and the rusted tools and the boxes of letters and the 3 complete sets of harness leather in varying states of usefulness. And we talked the way we had always talked, which is to say that we said exactly as much as needed saying and not a word more, and the silence between was the old kind, and it was not uncomfortable. We found, in a tin box at the back of the shelf, a bundle of letters from Vera's mother that Arvid had kept tied with a piece of ribbon, and Vera held them for a moment without opening them, and then put them in the box of things to keep. And I did not say anything about that either, because some things do not want saying. I left at midday. She thanked me for the help. I said it was nothing. I rode back to the work spread, and I told Bertil that the cedar chest could wait until Friday, and that I was going to fix the south pasture gate that afternoon. "How did it go?" Bertil said. "Fine," I said. "Just fine." I said what I should have said. She heard it. The rest is up to her. Bertil considered this. "That's progress," he said, with the carefully neutral tone of a man who is deciding whether to be hopeful. "Don't make more of it than it is," I said. I went and fixed the gate. The gate did not actually need fixing. I fixed it anyway, because a man has to do something with his hands when his chest is in the state mine was in that afternoon. She did not come to the well on Friday. I noticed this at 7 in the morning and again at 4 in the afternoon. I told myself the repairman from Tillman River had come for the home well. I told myself there were a dozen reasons a woman might not come to a neighbor's well on the day before she was leaving. I went to bed Friday night in the state of a man who has done the right thing, and is finding the right thing is no more comfortable than the wrong thing, just differently uncomfortable. I woke up Saturday at 5 o'clock. I lay in the dark for a while, listening to the valley settle into its pre-dawn sounds, the cattle moving on the bench, the creek running low and easy, the first tentative notes of the birds. The hired rig was coming at 8. She would be at Tillman River by midday, and on the east stage by early afternoon. I got up at 5:30. I did not have a plan. What I had was the clear and sudden understanding, standing in my kitchen in the gray before sunrise, that I was about to let this happen again. That I had told her what I should have told her, which was necessary, and I had told myself that the rest was up to her, which was a reasonable thing to tell yourself. And I was now watching the reasonable thing carry her away from Dray Valley for the second time, and somewhere around 5:45 on a Saturday morning in September, I decided that reasonable had had its turn. I went out to the barn. Decker was 15 years old and somewhat opinionated about early starts, but he had been my horse for 12 of those 15 years, and he understood urgent from the set of my shoulders. I had him saddled in 10 minutes. The valley was just beginning to color at the edges when I rode out of the work yard and turned east on the valley road. The morning was cold, the way the high plateau is cold in September even after a warm summer, the kind of cold that burns the back of your throat and makes the horses blow steam and makes everything very clear and very real at once. I could see the Lund house as I came around the basalt outcropping, and there was smoke from the chimney, but the front door was closed, and the hired rig had not yet arrived, and I pulled Decker up at the gate. I dismounted. I knocked. She came to the door in her traveling clothes, the gray dress and the practical hat, and for just a moment she looked at me with an expression that I cannot fully describe, not surprise, not hope, not wariness, but some arrangement of all three of them together that told me she had been expecting something without knowing what. Her trunk was by the door. The cedar chest was against the wall. The quilt was on top of it, still folded, and it was still not packed. "The rig comes at 8, she said. "I know," I said. "Vera, I need to say the rest of it." She stepped back from the door. She did not invite me in, but she left the door open, and I came in. I stood in the middle of Arvid Lund's kitchen for the second time in 3 days, and I said the rest of it. "I am not a man who says things easily," I told her. "I think you know that. I think you knew it when we were young, and I think part of what happened, what I let happen, was that I told myself you knew it, and so the saying was less necessary, and that was, Vera, that was wrong. That was very wrong. You deserve to have it said, not just understood." She was watching me with that straight, clear look. "I want you to stay," I said. "Not for 3 weeks. Not to sort the house. I want you to stay in Dray Valley, and I want to court you properly, the way I should have done 15 years ago, and I want, if you'll have it, to make you a home here. A real one. Not what we had before, not the fence line and the understanding without the saying of it. The thing itself. The meadowlark was at it again out in the bunchgrass. Somewhere down the valley rode the sound of wheels on gravel, announced the approach of the hired rig from Tillman River, still a good quarter-mile distant. The morning light was coming into the kitchen window, the same east window it had come through on Thursday, and it lay on the kitchen table and on the folded quilt and on the space between us. Vera Lund looked at me for a long moment. "You're 15 years late, Cale Rourke," she said. "I know. And you're doing it on the morning I'm leaving, when I have a trunk by the door and a hired rig coming up the road." "Yes. And you expect me to, what, put the trunk back and stay?" "I'm not expecting anything," I said. "I'm asking you can tell me no. You can get on that rig and I'll watch it go and I'll have no complaint about it, because you've got every right and I've given you no good reason in 15 years to choose differently." I stopped, then. "But I will not let you leave without saying it this time. Whatever you decide, I am not going to stand at a fence line and watch you go without saying it. I did that once and it cost me everything, and I'm old enough and stupid enough not to do it twice." The wheels on the road were louder now. Vera looked at the trunk. She looked at the quilt on the cedar chest, still folded, still unpacked. She looked at me. And then she crossed the kitchen floor and she went out the front door. And for one moment I did not breathe. And then she went to the gate and she waved to the approaching rig driver and she called out to him, her voice carrying clear and firm in the morning air, that she would not be needing the rig today after all. And could he let the stage depot know she wouldn't be on the afternoon east stage? And the driver, a phlegmatic man named Cal Dutchine, who had been driving that route for 9 years and had seen most things, touched his hat and turned the rig around without particular comment and headed back down the valley road. She came back through the gate. She came back to the door. She stood in the doorway and she looked at me in the kitchen and she said, "You're going to have to be better at the saying of things. If we are doing this, you're going to have to say more of it." "I know. I mean it. I'm not 22 years old and I have not got another 15 years to spend guessing." "I know," I said. "I'll be better at it." "See that you are." She came back into the kitchen and she began, without any further discussion, in the direct and practical manner of a woman who has made up her mind, to unpack her trunk. I stood there for a moment watching her, and then I helped. We did not do anything dramatic that morning. There was no scene worth describing to a crowd. She unpacked the trunk and I carried the things back to their places, and we drank coffee at the kitchen table and talked about what needed doing with the Homewell casing, and whether the school at Tillman River could use a teacher in the spring, and what Arvid had done to the south fence that had made it lean eastward, and whether it was worth digging out the root cellar or letting it go. Ordinary talk. The talk of people who are beginning to plan. At some point she said, "Me Gruder is going to be insufferable." "She already is," I said. "She came by on Tuesday. She spent 45 minutes telling me about the light in your barn window." I looked at my coffee. "She came by the spread Wednesday evening with a pie dish." "A pie dish." "Returned it. Borrowed it in 1879. Vera looked at me with an expression that took me a moment to recognize as the beginning of laughter, which she held in check with the same iron composure she applied to everything, but which showed at the corners of her eyes. She's been holding that pie dish for 8 years waiting for the moment. Apparently. She did laugh then, briefly and warmly, and it was the first time I had heard her laugh in 15 years, and I sat with it the way you sit with the first warmth of a fire after a long cold ride, not moving, not saying anything, just letting it be what it is. We worked through the morning. I went back to the work spread at noon to tell Bertil what had happened and to change my shirt, because Bertil deserved to know, and because I had been wearing the shirt since 5:30 in the morning and it had been through a barn, a gallop, and 2 cups of coffee. Bertil's response was to put on the good coffee pot, the one he kept for occasions, and to produce from somewhere a bottle of rye whiskey that I had not known was in the kitchen. "Not yet," I told him. "No," he agreed, "but soon." I rode back east in the afternoon. In the weeks that followed, Dre Valley had ample time to form and distribute its opinions, which it did with its customary efficiency. Me Gruder's was that she had seen it coming since 1872 and had only been waiting for the pair of us to catch up. Prentice Holt's was that it was about time. The Hay man's was that he was glad somebody had said something to somebody. The opinion that mattered to me was Vera's, expressed not in any single statement but in the accumulation of things. The way she stayed, the way she came back to the work spread for supper on a Thursday and did not leave until the moon was up, the way she taught herself the windmill joints and the fence-post drill, and the particular stubbornness required to run cattle on the eastern bench of Dre Valley, where the weather comes from 3 directions at once, and only the foolish are ever surprised by it. I courted her for 2 months, which in Dre Valley is considered a reasonable length of time, and in the second week of November, we went to the county clerk's office in Tillman River in a wagon loaded with Vera's remaining boxes and a cedar chest, and a quilt her mother had made in the first year of a long marriage, and we signed the papers that needed signing, and the clerk, a narrow man named Driscoll, who performed marriages with the enthusiasm of a man stamping postal forms, told us what we needed to say, and we said it, and it was done. Bertel opened the bottle of rye whiskey that night. I will tell you one more thing, and then I am done. On the night before we were married, I sat on the porch of the Rourke house in the late dark and looked east down the valley toward where the Lund homestead sat, 2 miles away, the one she had grown up in and come back to and now would leave for the last time. I thought about Arvid reading those letters in the feed store, cracking on the good parts. I thought about a fence line and a well and a long November of separate silences. I thought about 15 years, which is a long time to carry something and say nothing about it. And then I thought about Saturday morning, and the hired rig turning back down the road, and Vera coming back through the gate, and the way she had said you're going to have to be better at the saying of things with the firmness of a woman who already knew the answer but required it spoken, and I understood, sitting there in the night air, that the saying of things is not a concession. It is not weakness, and it is not overreach, and it is not taking a liberty. It is the whole work of it. 2 people can understand each other across a fence line for 20 years, but the understanding, unspoken, does not build a house or warm a hearth or keep anyone from the eastbound stage. The saying is what makes it real. The saying is what the other person is owed. I had said it. 15 years late, 2 days before the rig, at 5:30 in the morning with no plan and no preparation and a lot of ground to cover. But I had said it. We were married in November, and the winter that year was not unkind. The cattle came through with no major losses. Vera took the teaching post in Tillman River in the spring and rode in 3 days a week and came home the other 4, and the children who learned to read under her care in the years that followed were, I am told, notably good at saying what they meant. I cannot take credit for that. I can take credit for saying it when it still mattered, if only barely, and for riding east on a September morning with nothing prepared, except the understanding that the fence line was done. Dre Valley never lets you forget a thing. Me Gruder dined on the story for the rest of her life, and she lived to 81, which is a long time to tell a story. Bertel retired in 1894, and I gave him the good pasture land near the creek to do with as he pleased, and he raised the most opinionated kitchen garden in the county. Prentice Holt's opinion, updated by 1890, was that it had been the most romantic thing to happen in the valley since his own parents' courtship, which I think overstates the case considerably, but I did not argue. The cedar chest sits at the foot of our bed. The quilt is on it in summer and on the bed in winter, the small red diamonds of it worn soft and familiar by 30 years of a good marriage. I look at it sometimes, in the early morning when the light comes through the east window, and I think of it folded on the chest in Arvid's house, unpacked, waiting to see what I would do. I am glad I did something. I am glad, beyond anything I know how to say easily, that she stepped back from the door and left it open. That is the whole of it. The valley knows the rest.